1. The bubble. Marty had to go all the way across the bubble every morning, since school and his parents' apartment were both on the perimeter but almost exactly opposite. This did not present much of a problem. He only had to walk 100 yards to pick up an auto cabin. After that, he punched his destination on the dial and the robots took over, swinging the cabin out onto the overhead cable and plotting the course which would take him most directly to the school depot. He timed it once at 20.5 minutes and knew it would never vary by more than seconds. It could have been a bore, but he usually had enough homework held over to pass the time. The dial panel served as a desk, fairly stable except when the cabin swung out onto a new line with a jerk that sent his stylo skittering across the plastic. That sometimes meant blanking out several lines and rewriting them. Morning was Earth time, of course. The sun took 14 days to arc its way across the sky above the bubble, its glare reduced but not eliminated by the film sprayed on the inside of the huge transparent dome. And then, for another 14 days, there was night. The stars and the bright globe of Earth surrounded by the deeper blackness of space. That was how it was now, but the long lunar night was approaching its end. Tomorrow, the sun would be up. A minute before the journey's end, the dial pinged softly at him. Marty set about gathering his things. He looked out of the side and saw a boy from his class, Ben Trelici, in a cabin that was on a line converging with his towards the school run-in. There was some fun in gauging which would hit the relay first and slide through while the robot controls held the second cabin back. His was the one that made it, and he gave a thumbs-up sign and grinned. Other cabins were coming in, and he checked them over to see if Paul was in one. He was not, though. Marty's guess was that he was already in school. He himself was a couple of minutes later than usual. It was only at assembly that he realized that Paul must be away. He was surprised at that. They had visiphoned the previous evening about a problem in maths, and he had seemed okay then. Moon sickness, of course, could come on you pretty quickly. Even after nearly 50 years of people living in the bubble, the doctors did not understand it completely. They said it was partly a disturbance of the inner ear, partly psychological. It would have to be moon sickness. Owing to the barrier precautions and the isolation, there were no other forms of illness. In films, he had seen people on Earth suffering from things like flu and head colds and wondered what it must be like to have to cough and sneeze like that. The first class was history. They were doing the Roman Empire, and Mr. Milligan, the teacher, ran a reconstruct film on the screen. You saw a Roman family on the day of a triumph, watched the yawning slaves prepare breakfast as the deep blue sky paled behind the roofs of the villa, heard the creak of ox cart wheels in the narrow streets where the stone, through the long years, had worn into deep ruts. The family itself consisted of father and mother and 5 children, 2 boys and 3 girls. One of the boys was about Marty's age. He ate figs and crusty bread for breakfast, washing it down with watery wine, and was dressed in a toga, which he had just become old enough to wear. Dawn had broken over the city of Rome, and the sun was a soft gleaming gold in powder blue. Marty let his gaze stray from the scene to the windows of the classroom. Mr. Milligan had not blanked them. Teachers rarely did during the lunar night. They looked through the transparent wall of the bubble to the plain and distant mountains. Nothing moved or changed there. In the brightness of earthlight, one saw the stretch of flat blackness and the faraway jagged peaks. 1 or 2 of the high points dazzled white. First signs of a very different kind of dawn. He came back to the film. With the soundtrack muted, Mr. Milligan was pointing out things of which they ought to take special note. The atrium with its tinkling fountain, the triclinium, with couches along 3 sides of the great dining table. Then the family set out, attended by slaves, for the Senate stand from which they would watch the procession. The girls and their mother rode in litters, but the senator and his sons walked through the colourful and now crowded streets. In schools on Earth, Marty gathered, reconstruct films gave you the smell of the scene in addition to sight and sound. He had asked his father why this was not done on the moon. Was it a technical problem? Not technical, his father had said, but a matter of policy. Smell was the most powerful of all the senses, and they did not think it advisable. English followed. They were on the late 19th century romantic poets. Mrs. Kahn read Swinburne to them. The full stream feeds on flower of rushes. Ripe grasses trammel the travelling foot. The faint, fresh flame of the young year flushes. From leaf to flower and flower to fruit, and flower and fruit are as golden fire. And the oat is heard above the lyre, and the hoofed heel of the satyr crushes the chestnut husk and the chestnut root. Streams, he thought, rushes, grasses standing high by a riverside and full of flowers, trees breaking into leaf in spring after a long winter. He knew what they were. He had seen them on television and the cinema screen. He had even seen one fantasy film in which satyrs ran wild through a sunlit glade. He felt a bit lost at break. Paul and he usually gossiped about TV or continued one of their interminable games of chess, or just sat about idly and companionably. They kept more or less to themselves, although everybody knew everybody in the bubble. People made 1 or 2 friends and stuck to them. This morning Marty was on his own, so was Steve across, but this was usual. He was an orphan, both his parents having been killed in a launch explosion when he was 5 or 6, and a loner. He was not much liked and gave the impression of not minding that. He had a sharp tongue. The teachers were not enthusiastic about him either. He often broke rules and always gave the impression that he might be just going to. Then, with break almost over, Marty saw Paul come in at the door. All Lunarites, the name given those who had been born on the moon, were taller than they would have been on Earth, but Paul was more so than most. A 6-footer at 14. He had a thin, gangling frame and a face that was ugly except when he smiled. That was his usual expression, though, and he smiled now, catching sight of Marty. But there was something else in his look. Something odd. Marty said, "How is it? I thought you must have the sickness." Paul shook his head. "I'm fine." "Then how come you missed the first 2 classes?" "Not that there was anything to miss." "Oh, I had to see old Sharon. Dad brought me in." Sharon was the principal. Marty asked curiously, "What about? Flunking physics in the last exams?" "No." There was something which he seemed eager and reluctant to tell. Marty said impatiently, "Oh, then what?" "My folks have decided that they're sending me down." Sending down meant only one thing, one destination. The globe lighting the black sky above their heads. Marty could not believe it. He said, "But why?" Paul shrugged. "Oh, some medical stuff." "And when?" "Next flight." "That's..." "Yeah," Paul said. "Next week." Marty thought about it in the cabin going back, about the whole business of living in the bubble and what it meant. Those who came here did not go on home leave. The cost of transporting a human being across 250,000 miles, although less than it had been once, was still fantastic. You contracted, usually in your early 20s, for 25 years service. At the end of that time, you retired to Earth with enough money to make your retirement years easy, even luxurious. This meant living for a quarter of a century under the unnatural, artificial conditions which the moon enforced. As much as possible was done to make them tolerable. There was family life, for instance. Men and women were recruited in roughly equal numbers, with a preference for married couples or those engaged to be married. They could have children, though large families were discouraged. The children grew up in the bubble, never knowing anything else except at second hand on a screen. At any time after early childhood, parents could, if they chose, decide to send them down, send them back to Earth. The snag was that the trip was only one way, and once only. Parents and child would not see each other again, except on the expensive interworld Visiphone link, until the end of the parents' tour of duty. Balloonerites sending down also involved several weeks of conditioning in a special unit, with gravity slowly built up to full Earth strength and muscles trained to bear the extra weight. Marty, like Paul, was 14. He'd been born in the bubble 5 years after his mother and father had come to the moon. Their contract had 6 more years to run. There had been some talk of going back to an Earth university when he was 19, which would be a year before their return. He'd never thought of going down earlier, but neither, so far as he knew, had Paul. His mother was in the apartment when he arrived. She did a job of work outside the family, as everyone in the bubble did, but her duties in the food programming section were geared to fit in with Marty's school day. She looked tired, more so than usual. She smiled and kissed him and asked him how school had been. He wondered if she would say something about Paul. News travelled almost instantaneously around the bubble, but she did not. Because of that, he said nothing either. They talked about ancient Rome. She said it had been her favourite period of history when she was a girl. He asked her, "Did you ever get to visit there? Rome, I mean." She nodded. "We spent a year there once. Father, your grandfather, had lived there when he was an art student." "What's it like?" "Oh well." She looked at him. "You've seen modern Rome on the films. That one last week. I know, but I mean, what's it really like?" She looked away from him. "Oh, so long ago, Marty. I don't remember properly." She looked through the window towards the ramp. "Oh, I think that's your father." Marty glanced at his finger watch. "It's too early for him. He said he might get away early today." The door opened, and she said with what sounded like relief, "Hello, darling." They kissed, and his father said, "Hi, boy. They let me off the leash half an hour before time. How about you and me heading up to the reservoir and catching us 2 or 3 trout for supper?" The reservoir, like the park in which it stood, was one of the things intended to make life more natural. Keeping the recirculated water of the bubble in this small open lake meant an extra cost in the filtering and purifying plant. All such costs had to be very carefully considered. The moon colony did what it could towards paying its way by mining and refining precious metals, which were rocketed back to the mother planet, but apart from that its value lay in the less commercial fields of astronomical, selenographic, and interplanetary research. The taxpayers back home footed the bill, and there was small scope for luxuries. This one, though, was regulated as justifiable. The water in the lake was only a degree or so below the bubble atmosphere temperature, or 18 degrees centigrade, and trout flourished in it. Anyone who wanted to fish for natural protein was at liberty to do so. Other fish were grown in tanks. Meat came from the factory farm, with battery chicken as the mainstay. We gave it a lot of thought, your mother and I. We decided to keep you till you were ready for university. Maybe we were being selfish, I don't know. One of the arguments on our side was that you and Paul were such buddies, had been since you crawled round a sandpit together, before you could walk. I guess that one has kind of blown up in our faces. Marty did not say anything. His father went on. We've been thinking about things again. We decided you're old enough to make a decision for yourself. If you want to go down, we'll fix it. Where would I live? Well, we've got relatives in different places. You could have a choice. His father had spoken evenly and casually, but Marty realised there was nothing casual about this, nor about the decision he should make. He was excited and guessed the excitement could have shown in his voice. He was a bit ashamed, and realised something else, that it really would mean leaving them for 6 long years. He would be down on Earth and they would be still up here in the bubble. He imagined seeing his mother's anxious face, not in reality but on the flickering circle of the visiphone screen, rationed to a few minutes at a time. He said quickly, "It doesn't matter. I don't want to go down." "You're sure of that? You could give it a thought. You don't have to make up your mind right away." "I'm sure," he said. "I'm fine here." "Well, then I'm very glad, especially on account of your mother. She made me promise not to say this before you decided, but she's not well." He caught Marty's quick look and went on, "No, it's not anything serious. It's just that life here is more of a strain on some people than others. They miss things more, things they knew back on Earth. Your mother does." "But you don't," Marty thought with sudden resentment. He looked at his father's tall, upright figure, the strong chin, high cheekboned face, steady grey eyes. "You're happy enough here." "It would have been rough for her if you had decided to go. It's going to be pretty rough for Mrs. Miller." The excitement had gone. In its place, there was a sick feeling in his stomach. He'd been offered the trip to Earth and had turned it down. There was no going back. He was stuck with the bubble now. His father said, "Hey, you're not watching your line. That looks like a big one." He went with the Millers to the launch station. It was 6 miles away along the edge of the Sea of Rains, as a precaution against blow-ups damaging or maybe even destroying the bubble. The caterpillar tracks took them steadily with occasional jolts across the moon's surface, from time to time plunging through dust pockets and sending dust scattering on either side, a shower of floating sparks in the rays of the risen sun. Nobody spoke much. At the launch station, they went on board with Paul and saw him for the last time, with all of them crowded together in the capsule. There was the bunk in which he would lie, cushioned for takeoff and for landing. It was hard to believe that in a few weeks he would be breathing the air of Earth, not inside a protective dome, but out of the whole wide sky of the planet. Paul said, "You'll write to me. I'm counting on that." "Sure," Marty said. "You too, if you don't find you have too many other things to do." But he would, of course. Paul said, "I won't. Bye, Mum. Dad, I'll visiphone you right away, soon as I land." Mrs. Miller kissed Paul. Mr. Miller put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing hard. Then they had to get out and take a cabin across to the control centre. From the viewing level, they heard the relay of the countdown and saw the exhaust gases rise in a fiery cloud from the pit before the ship itself began to rise. Sliding out of its sheath, slowly at first, and then faster and faster until it was a gleaming, vanishing speck in the sky. That was when Mrs. Miller started crying. She had stopped by the time they took the crawler back to the bubble, but the silence was worse than on the way out. Marty left them at the main airlock to make his way home. Mr. Miller said, "Thanks for coming along, Marty." Mrs. Miller said, "You'll come and see us, still?" Her hands held his lightly. "We wouldn't like to lose touch with you, Marty." As if one could lose touch with anyone inside the confines of the bubble, he said, "I won't lose touch, Mrs. Miller.